Well, Israel's war on Gaza has already killed more than 42,000 Palestinians, but just about 50 kilometres away, it's waging a parallel war in the occupied West Bank. Israeli forces and settlers have killed 751 Palestinians this past year alone. The latest escalation started in late August, with a large-scale military assault involving Israeli fighter jets, drones and thousands of soldiers, the likes of which have not been seen in over 2 decades. They placed cities under siege for days, destroying roads, tearing down electricity and communications lines, and obstructing access to food, water and hospitals. The territory is already dotted with ever-expanding illegal settlements, populated by right-wing Israelis, many with the goal of driving out Palestinians. Backed by Israeli forces, settler attacks have increased drastically, from killing Palestinians to burning their homes and farms. In July, the UN's top court ruled Israel's occupation of Palestinian land is illegal and should end. Yet, Israeli politicians have been clear in their intention to annex the West Bank. And Palestinians say, at the same time as the genocide is happening in Gaza, the violence in the occupied West Bank is causing irreversible damage. Nida Ibrahim begins our special coverage. An important note to our viewers, this report was filmed before Israel shut down our Ramallah offices, preventing Al Jazeera from operating in the occupied West Bank.
He was not a military target, his family says. Yet Tawfiq lay on the ground for hours, his body desecrated. Sireen Qandil's father was 83 years old and hardly a threat, she says, to the Israeli forces invading Jenin in the northern occupied West Bank.
He wanted to buy us bread. I told him the market was closed, but he insisted. I warned him, they'll kill you. If only I'd kept him at home.
Even homes are not safe in Palestine. Suna Sruji was inside her house in the Tul Karim refugee camp when Israeli forces began bulldozing the walls.
My son and I ran to this room. They saw us, but they didn't tell us to leave. We escaped through the back door to our neighbors. The next day, we returned to find our home burned. We don't know why.
During military operations in the past year alone, Israeli forces have demolished 6 times the number of homes in the occupied West Bank than they did in the past 10 years combined. Since October the 7th, the Israeli army and settlers have killed more than 700 Palestinians, nearly half of them in Jenin and Tul Karim. In September, Israeli soldiers were filmed kicking and pushing the bodies of Palestinians off a roof in Qabatia, near Jenin. But many Israeli violations take place away from cameras. The Israeli military says it's fighting armed Palestinians. These men have no leadership, training or resources, but say the occupation leaves them little choice but to fight back. Some say the unprecedented violence in the past year has another goal.
They claim they're after explosives, but we think the grand scheme is larger. They want to empty refugee camps. Then they'll target cities and villages all across the occupied West Bank.
While a genocide unfolds in Gaza, many here believe that Israel is implementing a decades-long vision in the occupied West Bank. One that seeks to eliminate Palestinians' aspirations and prevents them from ever having an independent state. Nida Ibrahim, Al Jazeera.
Introducing Mustafa Barghouti, who's the Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative. He joins us here in the studio. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Barghouti. So the war on Gaza, as we've all been saying, has meant this accelerated annexation of chunks of the occupied West Bank, directly facilitated by the most hardened Zionist forces within Israel, who were previously on the fringes of Israeli politics, but are now very much in government. Just set the scene for us, what this means, what this slow creeping annexation, or accelerated annexation as it has become since October the 7th, means for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank.
Nothing of what we will say about the Israeli plans is hidden. It's declared officially by Israeli politicians, by Netanyahu himself, by ministers in the Israeli government. What we face here is a combination of 2 processes. The first one is that you have in Israel a fascist government, a truly fascist government supported by an increasing tendency towards fascism in the Israeli society, which means not only racism, but severe aggressive behavior that has no respect to the human life of any Palestinian. Second, you have a government that declares that its goal is not only to prevent the possibility of a Palestinian state or independence of Palestine, but their goal is to annex the West Bank, to Judaize the West Bank, to try to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians from all of Palestine, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and everywhere. In other words, what many people have been illusioned with, which is the possibility of a compromise with the Zionist movement, are now discovering that what we face as Palestinians and what the world is watching is a reactivation of the same settler colonial Zionist project that kicked out 70% of the Palestinian people in the worst act of ethnic cleansing in 1948.
Given the absence of, as you've suggested, of a potential middle path, an absence of the voice of reason, given, as you say, the presence of this racist, ultra-Zionist government in Israel, I wonder then, what in your mind are the justified parameters of resistance in the occupied West Bank and indeed across Palestinian territories?
The parameters are very clear. They are included in the international law, which says that any people who are under Israeli occupation or any occupation have the right to resist in all forms, including military forms, as long as they respect international law and international humanitarian law. The right to resistance is there. The funny thing and the strange thing and the sad thing, actually, is that so many Western government leaders keep talking about Israel's right to defend itself and never say Palestinian right to defend ourselves. Although we are the ones who are oppressed, we are the ones who are displaced, we are the ones who are under occupation, and we are the ones who are subjected to the worst system of apartheid. So the double standard here is so dramatic. And what they do is not only to say that Israel has the right to defend itself, they supply Israel with weapons, they supply Israel with financial aid, they supply Israel with political support to continue a system of oppression, occupation, apartheid, and now fascist behavior against the Palestinian people, so which reached the level of genocide, a true genocide by all international parameters.
So you suggest, given the nature of the occupation, that any kind of affirmative resistance by Palestinian armed groups in the occupied West Bank against the occupying force is legitimate under international law? Are you saying also the targeting of Israeli settlers as well in the occupied West Bank? Are they legitimate targets?
In my opinion, military resistance should respect international law and international humanitarian law, which means you don't attack civilians, you don't attack children. But in general, the right of resistance is guaranteed by international law. And the big question here for us as Palestinians and for anybody who supports the rights of people for freedom, what can we do with this fascist Israeli government? In my opinion, this fascist Israeli government will not be restrained, and Netanyahu will not be restrained, who is now conducting a wide war all over the region, without, first of all, resistance, and second, without sanctions. And what we need from the international community is to transform the sanctions that are practiced at the level of the people to sanctions that would be
talking about sanctions, we've had
sanctions
after sanctions issued at the United Nations. We've had unilateral sanctions from the United States, the United Kingdom, against specific settler groups within the occupied West Bank. I mean, these are, given what we continue to see, these are toothless moves.
It's nothing. To take sanctions against 4 or 5 people means nothing. What should be sanctions is the Israeli government. What should be sanctioned is Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are themselves settlers and are ministers in the Israeli government, are running the process of land appropriation, settlement building, and annexation. And what we need here is a true action similar to what happened in other cases. Why the double standard? Why 11,000 sanctions on Russia in less than 2 months And instead of punishing the Israelis here, they are supporting them. And in my opinion, the first thing that should happen is what the Spanish foreign minister said yesterday or today, that there should be military embargo on Israel. There should be immediate suspension of supplies of military weapons to the Israeli government, which is violating the laws, violating international law, and committing terrible crimes in Palestine, in Gaza, in West Bank, in Lebanon, and everywhere else, including, by the way, attacking people under occupation in the West Bank with airstrikes.
Let me ask you about other developments regionally as well. I wonder whether the spiraling tensions with Hezbollah, these continued attacks not only on the Dahia in southern Beirut, but also now in central Beirut, the attacks carried out by Iran on targets within Israel. Does that help? Does that hinder? Does that bring more security to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank?
I think Hezbollah has been very clear in three things. First of all, they don't target civilians. They concentrate only on military targets. Second, their whole confrontation with Israel could be stopped immediately, as they declared, if Israel stops the attacks on Gaza. But Israel wants to continue the attacks on Gaza and the attacks on Palestinians on the West Bank and isolate us from the rest of the region and then impose the Israeli will on everybody.
I want to talk about...
it's very interesting that...
Within the context of this, I want to talk about Palestinian unity in the time that we have here. Because in July, Fatah and Hamas signed this agreement in Beijing, didn't they? To end divisions, strengthen Palestinian unity. There have been, as we know, fierce differences between Fatah and Hamas, namely the recognition of the State of Israel, hopes of a two-state solution. Why was it important at that moment to show Palestinian unity?
Well, it wasn't Hamas and Fatah that signed the agreement. It was all the 14 Palestinian parties. I personally drafted that agreement with the approval of both of them. And that agreement spoke about forming immediately a national consensus government and a creation of a unified Palestinian leadership. This is so essential for us to face all these atrocities and also to face all these challenges. But unfortunately, the resolution, the agreement was good, but it was not implemented yet because the Palestinian Authority up till now did not make up its mind to start implementing what they have signed on. That is the issue.
And only, of course, a couple of weeks later, Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's political chief, was assassinated in Tehran, throwing all of this into disarray.
By the way, the question here, how could the world allow Israel to kill the person who was negotiating with them about ceasefire? We didn't hear condemnation of the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, nor did we hear condemnation of the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. If tomorrow somebody assassinates Netanyahu, will we see the same reaction? This double standard has to end. And the question here, in my opinion, the people who support Israel in this terrible manner and ignore the Israeli crimes are hurting Israel in the long run. Because at the end of the day, this situation will not lead only to Palestinian victims, but victims from both sides.
There are no winners in this. Mustafa Barghouti, pleasure to have you on Jazeera. Thank you.
Thank you.
Israeli attacks in the occupied West Bank this past year have been among the most violent, breaking all records of killings, detentions and demolitions of Palestinian homes. But the UN says a silent war is also taking place, one focused on seizing Palestinian territory and uprooting Palestinian families from their land. Norode reports.
Israel is waging two wars in the occupied West Bank. One campaign is record-breaking in its violence and destruction. The other is silent, but strategically potent. It is the war on Palestinian land and the existence of Palestinian communities under the cover of genocide.
What we're seeing in the West Bank is the strategic part. Maybe we can squeeze them into these little area A's. Maybe we have these different Bantustans. But wouldn't it all just be a lot easier if this territory became so unlivable, so onerous for Palestinians to live in, that there were simply less Palestinians there altogether?
Israel has illegally seized 27.8 square kilometers of Palestinian land, including areas the UN designated as World Heritage Sites. That's more than half of all the Palestinian land seized in the preceding 24 years. The Israeli government also authorized the construction of nearly 10,000 housing units in the more than 350 illegal settlements and settler outposts across the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. It took over urban planning and zoning in rural areas from the Palestinian government and integrated those powers into Israeli state bureaucracy, fulfilling its promise of fully annexing the West Bank, a promise that requires the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian communities. Since last October, Israeli forces have demolished nearly 2,000 Palestinian homes and structures and displaced nearly 5,000 Palestinians, including uprooting entire communities from their lands, affecting another 530,000 people. Then there are the rampant and escalating attacks by Israeli settlers, like this incident. Israeli settlers attacking a Palestinian school in the Jordan Valley, assaulting teachers and tormenting students. Before Israeli soldiers arrived and detained the teachers. It's a pattern of impunity and violence, with the army and settlers working hand in glove to conclude what they have termed the final and irreversible chapter of Israeli takeover, from the river to the sea. Noor Audi, Al Jazeera.
Yara Hawari is co-director of Al-Shabaka, that's the Palestinian Policy Network. She told Al Jazeera that Israeli settlers feel emboldened to attack Palestinians because of Israel's war on Gaza.
What we've seen since last October is this massive increase in settler attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank. Every day there's been at least several settler attacks, which has resulted in dozens of Palestinians being killed, hundreds of injuries, the destruction of property. And I think the reason for this is that they've been emboldened by the genocide in Gaza, where they've seen Israeli soldiers and the Israeli regime commit horrific acts of violence, where they obviously haven't faced any kind of consequences for that. So this has only emboldened Israelis in other parts of Palestine. But worse than that, the Israeli government has also actively encouraged them more than ever before to commit such acts. We've seen Israeli government ministers actively encourage settlers to attack Palestinians and even distribute hundreds of thousands of firearms to Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So we are seeing an escalation of something that's been ongoing for decades, but it's an escalation that is occurring specifically because of Israeli impunity in violating international law and in conducting its genocide in Gaza.
Well, during the year-long war, Al Jazeera has been on the ground documenting the aftermath of Israeli settler attacks across the occupied West Bank. Here's some of that coverage.
Jihad Idais guards his herd, and he's worried the Israeli settlers will come back and take them away. The attacks often happen at night. We go to speak to the settlement council. We are not allowed in, and after repeated phone calls are told to email the council's lawyer detailing the case. The young unarmed settler looks nervous and refuses to answer our questions about Zohar, who watches us from inside his car, which is parked on a nearby hill.
Zohar, excuse me.
A few minutes later, he ignores us as we try to flag him down.
Green malt or wheat.
Yeah.
This one now is belong to Musa.
You can't access that.
Yes, he took this land. Musa, he's a settler.
Musa's real name is Moshe Sharvit. He's been sanctioned by the US and UK for being a dangerous and violent settler. While we were filming, Moshe pulled up. I asked him why he's taken the land.
We've tried. He's not speaking. He's just filming us.
He starts making calls and I'm told he has a concealed weapon. It's not safe for us to stay.
This is the most recent settler attacks against Palestinians here in Abu Falah. This is the village that is closest to Al Mghayr, and Palestinians here have been seeing ambulances rushing to go to Al Mghayr, where settlers have set fire to more than 40 vehicles and homes.
So far, 3 times this year, settlers have started fires trying to force people off their land.
Israeli settlers came down from an outpost on a hill overlooking the farm and tried to set fire to the barn, to the animals. You can still feel the heat rising from these mounds of ash that were bales of hay, feed for the animals.
The fire is still burning here in Burqa, where Israeli settlers set on fire several hundred trees in the village. Nobody has been able to come here and put the fires out.
Israeli forces have also stepped up arrests in the occupied West Bank since the war on Gaza began. Rights groups have sounded the alarm about detentions without charge, inhumane prison conditions and systemic abuse. Since October the 7th, Israeli forces have arrested more than 11,200 Palestinians there. That figure includes 740 children, 425 women and 59 journalists. More than 9,000 Palestinians are held under administrative detention orders, meaning they are being held without charge or trial with no time limit. Al Jazeera has spoken to countless Palestinians after their release from Israeli prisons. They told us about their ordeal and treatment in Israeli custody. Here's a snapshot of some of them.
Behind these disoriented looks is a man who doesn't recognize his family or know where he is. He's lost. But Muazzaz Abayat can recount exactly what happened to him in Israeli jails and to those he left behind. A stark comparison from 9 months ago when he was a regular at the gym. Held without charge under an Israeli military order called administrative detention, this is the first time his family has seen him since October. The scan is interrupted several times. You're safe, the technician says, but Muazzaz flinches every time he hears a noise. He's in a Palestinian hospital, but in his mind, he's still in an Israeli prison.
أنا ميزته لأنه هو الزلمة الكبير اللي كان جاي قبالي، أخوي ما عرفه. وأنا أول مرة في حياتي بشوف أبوي حدا كبير بالعمر، ما عمريش تخيلت إنه لما بيحضنني يكون أصغر مني حجماً، يعني دائماً كان يكون أكبر مني حجماً.
حتى اليوم أنا نازل 29 كيلو. الأكل التي تقدم للإنسان غير كافية فقط من أجل أن لا يموت. بال 46 سنة كنت بالسجن، وقبل 30 سنة كنت بالسجن. لم تشهد السجون حالة مثل الحالة الراهنة. ال6 أشهر ظهور عن 6 سنوات من السجن. لم نكن لا معتقلين سياسيين ولا معتقلين إداريين ولا سجناء الرأي. نحن كنا رهائن.
He has vivid memories of his repeated arrest by Israeli police.
كانوا يضربونا ضرب بالبواريد على رؤوسنا وعلينا، 5 جنود يكونوا عليك وانت ممدد.
He was walking through this archway when he was shot at repeatedly. His family believe a man protecting a nearby settlement opened fire because the boy had come too close.
قدرت أحكي مع الدكاترة يعني إنه ليش الشرطة عندي أنا شو مسوي؟ قالوا لي إنك أنت مطخوخ في راسك وفي الحوض.
Abdurrahman's injuries were life-threatening.
قعدت أسبوع وأنا كنت في أسبوع في غيبوبة، بعدين أجوا مسكوني الشرطة، رحت على السجن.
Handcuffed to his bed, he was charged with hurling a petrol bomb, a claim he also denies. Abdurrahman insists he's not affected by his trauma.
عادي، أي شيء بأطفال فلسطين هيك بسووا الشرطة معهم. كلنا مخلوقين جدعان من ولاد جدعان.
Israel's crackdown in the occupied West Bank has also targeted journalists. Its forces have detained at least 108 Palestinian media workers there since last October. Nearly half of them remain in prison. Many of them face vague accusations of provocation. Other media, including Al Jazeera, have faced similar action. Israel has shut down the network's offices in occupied East Jerusalem and Ramallah in recent months. Lina Abu Akla has more.
Guns versus a microphone. Heavily armed Israeli soldiers storm Al Jazeera's bureau in Ramallah, ordering its closure for 45 days.
The occupation forces at around 3 a.m. raided Ramallah's downtown and closed the Shireen Abu Akleh street, where the building that houses the Al Jazeera office is located. Then after, they destroyed the main entrance and surrounded the area completely, and then stormed into the office.
This is just one of many assaults on Al Jazeera staff and other journalists in the occupied West Bank. And part of what many say is Israel's policy to suppress media freedom.
This is utterly, utterly shocking. I mean, it clearly comes as part of a long, drawn-out policy to try and stop free reporting. There's been, journalists have been locked out of the Gaza Strip. There's obviously been the terrible, terrible targeting of journalists in Gaza. There's been suppression of critical media within Israel and the attempt to stop Al Jazeera from reporting.
While attacks on media workers have long been a reality for Palestinian journalists, they have intensified since October 2023. Many have been harassed, prevented from doing their work, and even arrested. In November, the Israeli military arrested journalist Sumaya Jawabra while she was 7 months pregnant. She is still under house arrest. Over the past year, Israeli forces have detained 108 Palestinian journalists in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. Nearly half of them remain in prison. 37 of the arrested journalists are from the occupied West Bank, and 14 are held under administrative detention, meaning they are held without charge. Palestinian cameraman Mujahid al-Saadi is among them. He's been held without charge for 6 months after he was arrested from his home. But journalists are also being arrested for posting on social media. Palestinians say these are intimidation tactics Israeli forces use regularly. The UN says Israeli authorities have never investigated soldiers who have injured, harassed, or killed journalists in the occupied West Bank, including the Israeli sniper who shot and killed Al Jazeera correspondent Shireen Abu Akleh in Jenin in 2022, an attack which al-Saadi witnessed and survived. In the face of constant threats, Palestinian journalists say they are determined to keep doing their jobs, despite Israel's attempts to silence their voices. Lina Abu Akleh, Al Jazeera.